Hello, so today we're going to be going over all of the forecasts in the game. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the different itemizations for them. Of course, this is based on PBE, and these units are subject to change and can drastically change the way they're optimized and itemized when the set actually launches. But this isn't part of prepping for set 16 before it comes out next week. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm normally doing daily TFT guides. Also, for those that are paying attention to some of the stuff behind the scenes, I'm going to have a little bit of a merch drop tomorrow and some updates to some of the memberships that I have. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. There's going to be a decently nice announcement tomorrow, or hopefully nice announcement tomorrow. But anyways, basically I took all these forecast units. I'm going to break them down into the types of units that they are. So we're going to go over all of the melee style units, so units that kind of have lower range and attack in the front lines. We're going to talk about some of the tanks. We're going to talk about the AP units, or the AP caster types, and we're going to talk about the AD units, or the AD casters or auto attacker types. So going through all of them, let's start with the melee units. So obviously, whenever you're thinking about melee units, there are some common things that can work on a lot of the different units, right? Obviously, like survivability items like an Edge of Night, or anti-stun items like a QSS or a Titans, which gives you stun immunity once it gets its full stacks. Are going to be pretty common on a lot of the melee units, especially CC immunity, in my opinion, is going to be pretty important, because especially this set, there was a lot of outlets of CC or crowd control or stuns or stuff like that that can really disrupt your melee carries. But with a melee carry, so for example, Mbessa, she is a melee carry in the more traditional sense that she is an attack fighter or AD style melee unit. Obviously, you can give her omnivamps for survivability, and then obviously you can give her like one sort of survivability item because she's an AD unit. You can also give her a Sterex, because Sterex is going to give her a health shield. If you're not making any Sterex, you might want to give her something like an Edge of Night, just because she's going to dive into the back line or dive around, jump around, dash as part of her kit, so she can be subject to doing damage. Last item, you can go for a third damage item, either to scale her in some way, so something that gives her damage amp like a Giant Slayer, or something that just gives her more scaling with either crit or Omnivamp. If you're trying to optimize for Mbessa, however, I think some of the better builds are going to be revolving around crit. So she already has a built-in Vanquisher, which gives her basically like having an IE, so she gets free crits. But to make those crits more consistent, something like a crit item like a Hand of Justice, which uses a glove, is going to increase the critical strike chance, so she's more consistent at actually getting those crits. She also has an overkill effect, where or not overkill, excuse me. She has an effect that when she kills an enemy, she will like recast and do another cast of damage. So if she's able to like kill a unit or just like hit like a truck, it's going to be really important. So with Mbessa, if you're trying to play her as a primary carry, for example, what I would recommend is maybe something that's a little bit more along the lines of like a Hodge Strikers, right? She's going to be more consistent with her crits with higher critical strike chance. And then of course, you're going to have the damage amp from Strikers, so then she can just like drop a nuke. And then last item could be something like a Sterex that gives her more base stats, like more base AD, so that she just like, and survivability, so just like drops a truck on people. Of course, you can also give her like CC immunity like Titans and just ramp up her AP and AD that way as well. So currently there's a lot of different builds that work with her. And Mbessa right now isn't super like primary itemized, so to speak, because a lot of times you're just playing Mbessa to unlock Mel, which is like a much stronger unit in PBE. So we'll see which of these types of builds becomes the most consistent. But I do think something like a Hand of Justice with like maybe a Strikers might be something for like building her as like a primary like giga damage type of unit, and then some sort of CC immunity or survivability item. Next, let's go Bel'Veth. Bel'Veth is a melee fighter, but she is different than some of the other ones. For Bel'Veth, she's actually an attack fighter, but she has 2 hex range, which means she's not actually going to be in the front line directly. She's going to be a little bit further back. Now, Bel'Veth still dashes around, she transforms, she does this thing, but a lot of her power comes from her dealing a bunch of auto attacks. So she's kind of like an auto attacker melee unit with 2 hex range, so she's not completely in harm's way. So with Bel'Veth, I wouldn't try and build Edge of Night. I wouldn't build a lot of those other items. I would build her more like backline carry style items. For her, I think QSS is really good. Just attack speed and stun immunity. You can't go wrong. And then something like a Kraken's actually works well. And then scaling that with some sort of crit or damage amp is also going to be great. So something like this is actually a really common, really strong build on Bel'Veth, because she also has Slayer built in. So she doesn't need Omnivamp a lot of the times. You could build Omnivamp towards her and maybe play like, you know, like the Aatrox with the Bel'Veth. But I think if you're trying to play Bel'Veth as a primary carry, you can actually go with just going pure damage or a lot more in terms of like scale scaling attack speed damage items because of her kit basically being 2 hex away, and then like having this attack speed thing. Then as she attacks, it increases her doing true damage, right? A lot of times true damage, like in the past, there's like sometimes issues where true damage doesn't crit, so damage amp might be better. That's why I put the Giant Slayer here and not an IE. These are things that are looking a little bit better in PvE. Of course, like I said, we'll see if anything changes when she gets to live, but I think something like stun immunity and attack speed and like a Kraken's ramping up and then +1 damage item will probably be good on her. Next, we have the unlocks. So the unlocks are obviously going to be more situational on how you get them out there. Of the unlocks, the one that's very traditional in terms of like a melee style unit is Renekton. Renekton basically scales again with a bunch of attack speed, so you can actually build attack speed on him. But I think like, you know, stun immunity and like just making him like an absolute giga tank, drain tank monster, especially with Shurima that he has insane HP. Something like this is really common where you go Bloodthirster, Sterex, right? Base AD and the shielding, so you have some survivability. And then the stun immunity and extra stats from Titans is really powerful. But with Renekton, he actually attacks so fast, you don't have to necessarily build like a Gwinsu or anything like that. He has really high base attack speed and stuff, so pretty good like this, and he'll stack up the Titans pretty effectively. In terms of some other unique units or different units a little bit, we have Diana and Fizz. These are both assassins where they try and dive the backline. Usually with assassin type of units, you like to build them like for heavy damage so that when they get to the backline, they like one tap the enemy carry and you kind of scam the fight in different ways. But they are a little bit different, of course, because they also jump around a lot. With Diana, she jumps to like these marked enemies and then does a bunch of damage. Fizz will jump to furthest enemy within 4 hexes. He's a little bit more of just like an average jumper type of unit. For both these units, common builds usually over time are something along the lines of like Hodge JG, right? It's a really good item pairing because you're basically taking their ults, making them crit, right? You want to crit or do like heavy damage on the backline so that you teleport, instantly nuke the enemy carry, and then you can scam and win the fight that way. But specifically with a lot of these units, the Hodge also works well. Hodge gives mana gen, which we haven't talked about before, but especially on units that jump around a lot of times you like them to cast a bunch because it gives them an element of survivability, and then they can basically like recast, jump around, jump in and out of like attacking the back line and the front line, and it kind of gives them like an essence of living longer, like, you know, survivability, because like it's hard to target them and focus fire them down, but then also gives them the crit glove pairing, which makes the crits more consistent, right? If you just make your ults crit, you basically, if the ult crits or it doesn't crit, it's based on critical strike chance. So a lot of times when you make an ult crit, you want to pair it with other glove items such that you're able to actually realize the crit. Because if you ult and it doesn't crit, it doesn't matter you have JG. This just allows it to crit. You still need the chance to be high enough, which is why pairings like this are typically very common on these types of units. And they're both AP units. That's why we're showing the JG and whatever. Last item, you can actually treat a lot of these units very similar to how you do Akali and Katarina if you guys have played set 15 or tried out set 15 this set. I'm trying to make some analogies here, but like I said, mana gen is really important on these units just to jump in and out. You can actually give them like a Nashor's Tooth. Nashor's Tooth is just great, gives a bunch of stats, makes the crits more consistent with more critical strike chance, but then also grants mana on those crit builds, which allows it to jump in and out of danger. So something like these builds will be pretty good. But then also you can go for more base damage, right? You can give them like a Rabadon's for base AP, right? That you're going to crit and scale off of that if you're going for like a pure damage build. You can also give them the Giant Slayer, or sorry, Striker's Flail or a Giant Slayer, just give them some damage amp, but this works well because it's damage amp and crit. But last item, pretty flexible. You can even give them survivability if you're scared that they're going to die or get nuked if there's like a unit that they jump on and just die instantly. CC immunity might matter as well, but we'll see usually when they're jumping in and out, you know, usually CC is applied to like, or crowd control or stuns is applied to like when you're stuck in the front line, because like, you know, you're absorbing the damage. But if you're these assassin builds, a lot of times they're able to like go behind enemy lines and then they're not getting stunned behind enemy lines because the CC is elsewhere a lot of the time. Another unit, sorry, I didn't mention as well. Nidalee is also a magic fighter. Same thing applies with Nidalee. Nidalee doesn't jump in that much, by the way, and Nidalee's a little bit more tanky, so you might be able to get by with giving her more damage items. But Nidalee also doesn't necessarily it's like they jump on a lowest health unit, right? Like, but it doesn't necessarily dive the backline very easily, so you might need a survivability item on Nidalee, like CC immunity in the form of like a Titans or a QSS. right? One of these that makes it so that you can't be stunned, or you might want to give like an Edge of Night or something like that, because this unit might be a little bit more stuck in the front line. Nidalee also, if you're playing her and you have like the Nico 3-star, or you have the Nico upgrade, Huntress makes it so she's not targeted by basic auto attacks. You can still get targeted by like AoE damage and stuff like that, so it's a little bit awkward. You might be able to get by without having the survivability on her, but it really depends. It depends on your board, depends on the opponent's board as well. Next we have Warwick. So Warwick actually has, so we talked a little bit about like different builds, mana, attack speed type of stuff. Warwick has so much base attack speed because he has Quick Striker as a what's it called, as a trait or as a synergy. So when you're playing Warwick, he's gonna have a lot of attack speed, so usually you just want to make him like run around and do a bunch of damage. He also deals extra bonus damage with like scaling with AD and stuff like that. He has good scaling with AP and AD because his AP stat is going to buff the rest of your board. Usually you're playing him with Zon, so you have Vi and Jinx there, so you can also help out those units. One of the most important items on Warwick, I would say, is the Titans for the CC immunity. He's not like Bel'Veth where he's a little bit out of the way, and he's also not like some of the other melee carries where they're able to dodge some of that front line. This unit, if he gets stunned, he just dies, and so much of Warwick is like jumping and re-aggroing on other units, so you really want him to be unobstructed. And Titans, especially with Warwick, is going to stack very fast because he has that attack speed, both from his kit, also from Zon. Zon gives attack speed, also from Quick Striker. Quick Striker gives attack speed. And then with that, a lot of times you can go for like the typical, like, you know, survivability and shielding / AD because he scales mostly on AD. Bloodthirster for survivability. You could also maybe go like some crit builds like Hodge and an IE or Hodge and something else, but something like this is just very tanky and hard to deal with, and with all the attack speed that he has jumping around, he's just gonna live forever, be a nuisance, and do a bunch of damage, at least so far in PvE. I'm going to leave Singed to the last because he's very unique, but also I want to just talk about Yone. Yone is a unit that scales really well with attack speed because all of his auto attacks are empowered with both AP and AD. So if you're looking for an item that gives both AP and AD, obviously Giant Slayer is going to be one of those that just gives him a lot of stats, but also Titans, and he's going to stack it up pretty effectively as well. Yone has also been pretty effective with just Guinsoo. This unit also is probably broken, like the way that I see him, like it seems like any items on him are really strong, but I've also seen Guinsoo do really well just because him ramping up his attack speed is going to allow him just do so much damage because all of his auto attacks are going to be powered up by extra AD and AP because of his passive, right? Additionally, like a QSS, if you're worried about stun, might also work out pretty well. And then obviously some sort of survivability. So a lot of times I'll see something like this and then an attack speed item being a really good option. Some sort of bow item. Could also be a Kraken user as well, but something like this has been pretty effective. But last item is flexible. You can even like not worry too much about ramping the attack speed and just more upfront damage and do something like this with the Giant Slayer. Lastly, we have Singed. So Singed is unique in the sense that he is a magic fighter, so he's similar to the melee units, but I want to put him here. Basically just runs around and puts poison gas everywhere, and it just does a whole bunch of damage, and it's really obnoxious and annoying. He's basically been dominating the PvE right now, so everybody's assuming that he's going to get nerfed before live. We don't know for sure if that will happen. If he doesn't get nerfed before live, this is going to be the meta unit to play. If he does get nerfed before live, then we don't have to worry about him too much. He'll probably have his ankles broken. But either way, the current way that you build him is actually with just pure utility most of the time. There are many different builds, of course, but he's really hard to track down. He's really hard to kill. So him spreading his effects or his poison gas across the entire board allows you to put items like Morello and Void Staff on him that basically apply the shred effect to every unit that's on the board and apply anti-heal to everybody that's on the board. So you actually have a lot of potential to just like be a nuisance and just put all this utility, and then basically with Bloodthirster, if he ever takes damage, he runs away, so he gets de-aggroed because like as soon as he runs away, you stop attacking him, so he just heals back to full with Bloodthirster, so he just lives forever. So something like this is really common. If you're going for Singed to do like pure damage or do a lot more damage, then even something like Archangels works well with him right now. Like there's the augment that gives you an Archangels and helps you with like mana gen and stuff. Something like this, he's just never gonna die, and then he just ramps up the Archangels. He's gonna do more and more damage, AoE to the entire board, and a lot of times you just kill the backline units anyways. But currently right now he's more of like a utility bot on certain boards that enable him to do so. Next, let's talk about the tanks in the game. So the tanks, like as per usual, usually just building like your tank items in a way that makes sense for your units. So obviously, you know, you want to pair up some semblance of all of the tank stats, right? Durability, durability, resistances, and HP. A lot of times, you know, you'll often see something like, you know, Anima Visage or a Warmog, something that gives a bunch of HP or some durability, and then you'll pair it with, like, you know, armor or magic resist depending on what you need. So like very commonly you can build like your Giga tanks with these types of items, or interchange of Warmogs here, right? Lots of HP, lots of resist, so your tank is hard to chew through, right? You reduce the damage with the resist, and then you have a bunch of HP, so you live for a very long time. And then damage reduction could also apply there to make you live a little bit longer. And then some sort of passive healing item like Dragon Claw or Anima or Spirit Visage. Sorry, I say Anima, it used to be called Anima Visage, it was an Ornn artifact, so excuse me if you're confused when I mentioned the wrong name. But basically this item, right, giving you some sort of healing, some sort of healing with some sort of item is going to make your tank live for a very long time. Of the units, there are a couple nuances with some of them. So for example, Braum scales off of armor in terms of dealing some extra damage as well as AP. So you have armor and AP items that can work really well. Things like Crown Guard or things like just like a raw Bramble Vest is going to be a little bit more effective on some units like this. You have units like Garen, who scales off of HP really well. So obviously, like, you know, you might want to build more towards that as well. He also has some AD damage dealing as well. So something like a Sterex has potential on this unit. But of course, like, you know, you're more just focused on building your tanks. Of course, like, you know, you have Nasus, who basically gets like infinite HP or gets a huge amount of HP. So he can do really well with like any sort of passive healing item that heals percentage HP. Units like Wukong, when he dies, he summons a copy that basically scales with HP. But a lot of times, because he dies and revives himself and makes like a little target dummy with the same items, a lot of times utility items work really well on this unit in particular, just because they're going to stay up when he dies, right? So if you make something like a Sunfire and an Even Shroud, when he dies, it's still up, so it can help your rest of your Ionia board continue to do damage, because these effects will continue to persist. But obviously you can build them like a traditional tank as well. I believe Tarek also, he has a passive where he gives a bunch of magic resist, but that's pretty cool, so you can worry about that. Then we have other units like Rift Herald, just has like insane amounts of HP, so obviously anything that scales with HP or helps him to recover that HP, some sort of passive healing like Spirit Visage or Dragon Claw or Augment is going to help out quite a bit. In terms of these last two units, I just want to pull attention to Swain and Skarner. Swain and Skarner both have an insane amount of stun, right? Like, or sorry, a very long stun, right? So Swain is like the resident stun bot for the set. He just stuns the largest group of enemies, and that can be very impactful, can often sway the fight. Skarner, an unlockable unit, but basically with Skarner, he scales off armor as well, but he also has an insane stun, even longer than Swain. The Skarner stun is like really obnoxious and annoying. So with both these units, whenever you have a stun unit or a unit that their cast is extremely important, things like Protector's Vow starts to matter quite a bit. Protector's Vow, it might not be like perfect or completely essential on these units, but it is quite meaningful just because it allows them to get that stun off a little bit earlier, so to speak. I don't know why I blacked out, but whatever. So like, you know, obviously with Protector's Vow, you get the starting mana and the mana gen. So with a unit that has a stun, you might get the first stun off earlier, which can sway the fight in your favor, or you can get this multiple stuns off within a fight, which is what's really important. So think about mana gen on these types of units. It often pairs really well. Next, let's talk about the magic casters, or the AP style of units. So with these units, there's many different builds that can go with them, but they all seem pretty flexible right now in PBE, but obviously boards aren't fully optimized to play around them, and a lot of times they're stepping stones for some of the more expensive units in the game, at least in the sense right now. Lysandra has Invoker. Invoker, this set actually scales well with mana generation, because basically Invokers gain more mana from all sources. Sorry, it's probably a little bit cut off on the screen. So with Lysandra, she has a pretty good stun and does like AoE damage to everybody. You can build her as a traditional caster type unit, where you go like Shojin, JG, and then like, you know, this is like the classic, like, I have a mana item that generates my ult to go faster because I'm an AP unit, right? AP units, they don't scale off AD, so the only damage they do really is in their cast, right? Their cast is the most important thing. So you want to make sure you have a mana gen item, then you want to make sure that you take that and you have some sort of multiplicative effect with it. So here I'm showing you a very common build where you go JG, or Jewel Gauntlet, which gives you critical strike strike chance and ability power. Then you make the crits more consistent with something like strikers, but then also give yourself extra damage amp so that the damage amp multiplies with the crit, which multiplies with your base AP, which makes you do a lot of work. Also though, because she's an invoker, a lot of builds actually have put her on multiple mana generation. So for example, you can go like Shojin with blue buff. Blue buff might be a little bit better on her. I find her attack speed's a little bit slower than usually blue buff is better, but you can also pair her with an adaptive helm. I've seen double mana work really well on Lysandra just to get multiple stuns off, just because of Invoker, she generates more mana, so you get a lot of bang for buck by putting multiple tier items on her. But currently she's more of like a support unit. As she stands right now in PBE, a lot of the boards that play Lysandra usually itemizing towards one of the other AP units, usually a more expensive unit. So a lot of times you usually put like either double mana or like utility items because she hits like AoE, and also something like Void Staff, which also gives you mana gen. So it works in the same vein or same idea, so to speak. In terms of Lux in all right is the much more like traditional sense of a caster, right? She just casts her ult, does a huge amount of damage. Basically you just want to build her like in that traditional sense, right? So something like a Shojin, Jewel Gauntlet, and a Strikers, or you know, Strikers is interchangeable if you don't care about the crit consistency, or you think you're consistent enough via means of other augments or just in general. Then you can also go for like a damage amp item like Strikers, because Giant Slayer. Giant Slayer is just a little bit of a better item in general, just in terms of the bang for buck and the components used. But in general, just like, you know, she's an Arcanist, so you're going to be scaling up your AP naturally just by playing 2 or 4 Arcanist on a board with her. So if you're playing those synergies, then you just pair that with Jewel Gauntlet, take that base AP, multiply it by crit, take that crit, multiply it by damage amp. Now you're getting like, you know, multiplicative effects in order to optimize your damage in a meaningful way. Of course, with some of these units as well, when you're building these builds, you could also go for a Nashor's Tooth. I didn't mention it on Lysandra because Lysandra is usually more utility, but Nashor's Tooth is also an okay last item. It basically gives you more mana gen, so you're trying to get more ults off. It also works as a crit item, however you lose out on damage amp, so it's really situational, or I think it really depends on the unit having enough damage already in order to afford like the multicast, because then you're better off just getting the stats from something like a Strikers or a Giant Slayer. Next we have Seraphine. Seraphine's kind of hit the same idea, right? Just you want to generate mana, do those types of builds, right? Very commonly you can go the same thing. I think Seraphine's attack speed is pretty good, so a lot of times Shojin might be a little bit better. I'm not 100% sure. It's going to come down to optimizations when the set goes live. One thing with Seraphine though, she has a low mana threshold, and she also gains 3 notes every time she casts, and when she has 12, she does like this huge wave, which just does a huge amount of damage, and also has a healing effect on the allies. So I've seen a lot of people actually go for double mana generation on Seraphine, either by means of something like this, or by means of something like this. Because Seraphine, she has a little bit of a support aspect to her, so you don't care about like dropping a nuke and optimizing your damage and making sure you hit like a truck similar to Lux. You care a little bit more about just getting the effects off and kind of having that, like, you know, giant wave that not only does a bunch of damage to all the enemy team but also heals your allies, right? If you have that double mana gen, you can actually go pretty effective in you can actually be pretty effective in dealing that damage and getting those getting those support effects as well, because you need to get multiple casts off before she does the big wave. Next we have Veigar, or Veigar, however you want to say it. Google says one way, everybody else says another way, so, you know, choose who you want to be angry at. But anyways, passive, he gains more ability power from all sources. With this unit, he's actually a little bit difficult, or I find a little bit awkward in terms of how to build him. I'm not sure if he's going to get changed at all, or how he's going to be optimized when the set goes live, because right now he's not particularly amazing in PBE or in the beta. But in general, you can build him like a typical caster. However, his unlock condition requires you to have 2 Rabadons. So a lot of times you might end up with a build where it looks like, you know, this with double Rabadons. And you just scale him a bunch with AP, and he gains extra AP from all sources, so stuff like Rabadons could make sense on him. However, I think this is a little bit too much diminishing returns personally, right? Now, the unit itself, by the way, I want to mention, if you read, he has a built-in crit, right? His active, when he fires all of his shit, he can innately critically strike. So he has like a built-in Jewel Gauntlet. He will crit, right? That is the thing. Now the crit is also I find that's not super consistent, and I don't know if it's just the way it is. I don't know if there's like a bug, or I don't know. It's not like it's guaranteed to crit. It's like they can critically strike. So when you build something like this and you don't have enough crit strike chance, it feels like he doesn't crit that often, and then it feels a little bit of like diminishing returns because he's scaling AP, he's getting more ability power, and then you have the double Rabadons. I've seen a lot of people swap out one of the Rabadons, and I think that right now at least, more effective builds on him actually build double mana gen. Similar to some of the other units, he's very slow in casting, right? It takes him a lot of time to actually do the damage. So double mana makes him a little bit more consistent actually getting the damage off. But then there's also options where people will go with like a strikers, just to make it more consistent and to give him damage amp by that means. But like I said, you have to play around the Rabadon, so a lot of times you're going to end up being like something like this for probably most of the game. Also, by the way, Shojin versus blue buff is better when the unit doesn't have a lot of attack speed. It's gonna come down to optimizations though, because like blue buff is just a harder item to make a lot of the time because it requires 2 tiers. So then, like, you know, obviously sword and tier using different components in TFT is a little bit better. So on a lot of these builds when I'm showing blue buff or Shojin, both are pretty good. They made the items a lot more similar in like their use cases, but usually it's going to come down to how much attack speed you have, which is based on the rest of your items. If you're not building any bow items or any items that grant attack speed, chances are blue buff is going to be a little bit better. Or if the unit doesn't have an innately high attack speed, which a lot of the casters don't, then blue buff is going to be a little bit better. However, item economy, you have to use your sword somehow. You might not have 2 tiers. Shojin's going to be more of an often build for a lot of the units. So it's more so like, you know, if blue buff is better because of your particular build, obviously it's going to be better and it caps higher. But Shojin is going to be like the more go-to bread and butter that you're going to hit more often on a lot of these caster units. Lastly, we have Kaisa. So Kaisa, excuse the formatting, I had to pull up a different website that has like a bunch of numbers. We're just going to look at it for one section. Kaisa has a simulator, which we're going to talk about in 2 different parts here. But she basically will switch from being an ability power unit, or a unit that uses AP, or a unit that uses AD, depending on which one is which, or depending on which one is higher. And depending on which one is higher, that's going to be the type of damage dealer that she is. So here, now we're just gonna look at the side screen right over here. You don't have to worry about all of these builds and items. I'm gonna talk about them in a second anyways. But basically, right here, you'll see that she has a default ability. This is the AD version of Kaisa, which we'll talk about in a second. The AP version of Kaisa actually changes. So the AP version of Kaisa, basically she gains attack speed for the rest of combat, and then she empowers her auto attacks with AP. And every 5th attack does more AP damage instead. So she actually is not really as much of a caster unit when she's an ability power unit. She is actually a auto attacker, where she's empowering her auto attacks with AP. So one of the better items on her is going to be a Guinsoo. Now Guinsoo, obviously, as the fight goes on longer and longer, you're going to get more value off of it because it's ramping attack speed. But other bow related items are also going to be good, because basically she's just going to do a huge amount of damage with her attack speed. When she casts, she does gain that attack speed, so you might not need Guinsoo. However, just in terms of like an auto attacker build, usually when you want to just, you know, you're not worried about casting as much as you are just getting as many attacks off as possible. You want to have as much attack speed as possible. So when the set goes live, we'll see if she actually needs Guinsoo or if a certain amount of bow items is enough, right? That's basically what it comes down to. If the fight lasts long enough in the meta, or whatever the comp's optimizations are, if it's not like as explosive damage and you could stall out for Guinsoo, then Guinsoo is going to be good. If there's like everybody's getting nuked and the fight lasts only a couple seconds, then you're better with upfront damage and upfront attack speed in the form of bow items like a Giant Slayer for damage, or something like, you know, a red buff, or like, you know, stuff like that just gives you a bunch of attack speed up front and doesn't scale up. But for this purposes, Guinsoo is going to be a good go-to. Then, because she just does a lot of damage, you can also go for crits. She drops like a nuke on her 5th time going, like that's the whole thing. She auto attacks, and then the 5th time she like does like a huge amount of damage. So crit builds work really well. You can go Jewel Gauntlet with something like a Strikers, so just full crit, except instead of mana gen, you're going attack speed. Even something like Giant Slayer, just upfront attack speed bow item and damage amp can also work. Auto attacks innately crit a lot of the time, so you don't necessarily need like to have like the big crit, but for AP damage, the Jewel Gauntlet makes sense. So for consistency and damage output. But here you might not need the Strikers, but all is fine. So she's more of, the main takeaway is that she's more of an auto attacker. You don't want to build her necessarily with like a Shojin or something like that. Lastly, we have the AD units. So these units are going to be mostly casters or auto attackers. So for example, Misfortune, she is an attack caster. She has a passive where she has like ricochet damage, but then also every third cast she increases her waves, which is really powerful. So she'll basically do more damage as a fight goes on, so long as she continues to cast. So something that works out really nicely for her is some form of mana gen, either Spear of Shojin, like I said, if you have like for item economy and stuff, or blue buff if you're able to afford to make blue buff, or if you don't have bow items, that blue buff makes more sense because the mana gen matters more in that regard. But Shojin actually seems pretty good on her. Something with AD units is that a lot of times you don't necessarily need to have mana generation on them. And that's just because with AD units, they're different from AP. Because if you're scaling up your AD, for example, if I give this Misfortune an IE, right? All of her auto attacks as well as her ult will be scaled up by the IE, because the auto attacks that she does, like in between her ults, is going to scale with AD. So a lot of times with these units, when they get optimized later in the game, if the fights don't last long enough where multiple casts are meaningful, then you might see something like triple damage items on AD units. You might see something like, you know, Giant Slayer, Strikers, IE, and no mana generation. That's something that we'll see as the set progresses. I'll keep you up to date because obviously I'm going to be making a guide every day. If something changes or if something gets optimized a different way, I'll let you guys know about it. But for right now, Shojin seems pretty good, and IE, and then obviously you can go for the attack version where instead of dual gauntlet strikers, go IE strikers. With Misfortune as well, right now, she's kind of played in Bilgewater lines. Right, obviously she's a gunslinger, so she gains AD, so having the crit and damage amp makes a lot of sense. You don't have to give her like base AD, excuse me. But a lot of times because of Bilgewater, she's more of like a support-ish role, because there's some really good Bilgewater items that basically apply like some extra effects, right? So for example, Captain's Brew is one of her better options because this applies burn and chill, which you can just put on her, and then if you're rerolling Gangplank or playing the other Bilgewater units, she'll just apply that burn and chill, and she has like AoE where she's sniping and hitting multiple units, so it actually is pretty meaningful or pretty powerful. There's also like the really high cap Bilgewater items, I believe, right? Like there's this Flintlock, I think it's this one, the Lucky Doubloon is also pretty good, right? Because this gives attack speed and crit, so it works well with a crit build as well. But of course, the Bilgewater items, you want to build something where they're interchangeable, they're fitting in with like the rest of your build, obviously, right? But a lot of times, like, you know, the early Captain's Brew always often ends up on Misfortune because she's easy to apply it to the entire board, and it just helps you with your item economy. Next we have Yunara. So Yunara is not a caster, she is a marksman, which basically just means she's an auto attacker. When I say auto attacker, it means that most of her damage is going to be generated not from necessarily her ult, but from her just doing auto attacks. So with these types of units, you want attack speed. Same thing as we were talking about with Kaisa, this is the AD version of that whole discussion we just had. You're going to want stuff like Guinsoo. If the game gets optimized to a point where Guinsoo is not needed because it's obviously an item that ramps up over time, you might end up just building like multiple bow items on the Yunara. That's going to come down to like how things evolve. Obviously, if it's like really tanky, long fights, Guinsoo is good. If it's really explosive, quick fights, you want more upfront damage and just a singular bow item. But she's the resident, you know, Guinsoo Kraken holder. She's a little bit awkward in PBE right now because from set 15 to now, Kraken got nerfed. So it's actually a good deal weaker than it was in set 15. So these Guinsoo Kraken marksman's type of builds just are innately a little bit weaker. The other thing about her as well is that she has like extra true damage if she crits. So it's really impactful to actually have crit scaling on her. Even though she's an auto attacker where auto attacks are going to have innate crit naturally, actually building like an IE or a full crit build makes a lot of sense on her. But something like this usually is what you see on these types of units, right? Some sort of damage or scaling item here, either damage amp or crit. In this case, she scales with crit, so you give her crit. And then Guinsoo Kraken as like a combo of let me just ramp up my attack speed, and then as I ramp up, I'll gain a bunch of extra base AD, which will in turn scale each of my singular attacks to do more damage, because each of my singular attacks will scale with that AD as well. So that works out, something like this works out pretty well. But of course, we'll see if the optimization is whether or not you actually need the Guinsoo. She also has Quick Striker, which means that she does have a decent amount of attack speed already. So you might end up dropping this and going for like a full damage build, like something like this. And this might be strong enough and you don't need the ramping of the Guinsoo. Next we have Callista, who's an unlock. Callista, basically she summons these spears and then they reduce armor and they just do a huge amount of damage. Currently with Callista, the main thing that you see a lot of times is something like a Shojin. And you pair that usually with crit. She is a vanquisher, so you don't need to build IE. So when I say crit, a lot of times it's something like a Strikers or something like this, where you just give her a lot of damage amp and a lot of upfront power, and the Shojin just to help her to cast. Again, when you have these attack units, casting items often find their way out of the meta, and usually as boards get optimized and you require more and more damage to keep up, you end up dropping Shojin and just going triple damage item. That's fine. You can just find some other means of scaling her, like a Death Blade or anything like that, that you can use to multiply with that crit. Lastly, we have Kaisa. Same thing with Kaisa, right? Kaisa now, basically, she dashes and she does a huge amount of damage. I've seen Kaisa been triple damage because her mana is very low for her ult in this form. So a lot of times you don't need to build her with a Shojin. You can actually build her with triple damage. But you could also put a Shojin in place, but because her mana threshold is so low, it feels like if you're playing AD Kaisa, you just go triple damage, at least to me. Of course, you could go for the other builds, but currently with Kaisa, at least in PBE, the AP version is actually a lot better. So a lot of times people end up playing, not this one, the AP one, which I talked about before with the auto attacker style of build. But anyways, that was a rough breakdown of all of the units over here, talking about them all in terms of the itemization, just to give you a rough idea so that when you're playing the game, you know what you can aim for and have a rough introduction of them. Of course, like I said, right now it's PBE. The units are subject to change, of course. They've been changing a lot, and sometimes even the itemizations, how they're played, has been changing drastically from patch to patch because there are frequent patches in PBE. Of course, when the set launches, we'll see in a more holistic way how the units best items work out to be, but this is just serving as an introduction leading up into the set. Tomorrow I'm going to be going over, ideally tomorrow, but it might be the day after, I'm going to go over all the 5 costs as well and all of the 5 costs unlocked and talk a little bit about their itemizations and how they function. But this was just the introduction with the 4 costs, and then now you can kind of know a little bit of a game plan if you're trying to angle towards some of those and you haven't seen them yet. Thanks for watching. Hopefully that was fun and not too yappy, and there was some useful information there if you haven't seen how some of these units function. And of course, I'll keep you guys updated as things evolve, what the better options are for the units when things get onto live server. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and see ya. Bye bye.